Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski. This is the podcast where we look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And of course, we always like to talk about sustainable design as well. I've got a great guest with us today. Phillip Kuehne is with HDR. He is a sustainable design leader. Phillip, welcome to the show. It's great to finally get to chat with you.
Thanks for having me, Joe. I have to say, it's a real honor to be a guest here. There's quite a number of guests you've had previously that I personally admire and look up to for their work as well. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, we've had a lot of good luck with getting some wonderful guests on the show, and we'll add your name to the roster today. Let's start by allowing our listeners to get to know you. Tell us, why you decided to become an architect, and tell us a little bit about the journey that led to you becoming a sustainable design leader at HDR.
Yeah, so my origin story for becoming an architect has no real sort of aha moments. Like looking back, I didn't, as a child, sort of dream of being an architect, I have to say. And so it was kind of, in some sense, like an organic journey on the architecture side where, I think there are some moments in my childhood looking back where things that I was exposed to that sort of kind of started that journey down that path. As a child, I spent a lot of time outdoors, and it was just sort of a general curiosity around making things and draw. Later in life, it's sort of drawing, an interest in drawing as well, both sort of artistic drawing and then later on technical drawing. And there was sort of one early childhood photo of me where my parents, they had bought a house, or I should say, bought a piece of land in a suburb in New Jersey, and they were actually building their first house. And there's a photo of me. I was only 1 year old and sort of face planted in the mud. And I think that the character of that photo kind of sums it up, and that, like, I really did spend a ton of time outside. And I think that exposure to nature really sort of also engendered a sort of appreciation and probably ultimately led me to an interest in sustainability as well, and the natural environment. So later in life, in high school, I sort of had to answer the question, okay, what do you want to do as a career? And at that point, I had taken some woodworking classes and technical drafting classes, both of which I really enjoyed. And so I think, there was someone had suggested, hey, maybe you should think about architecture. And in many ways, I was very lucky because I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And then it really clicked when I went to undergrad at NJIT. And then from there, I was practicing architecture for about 10 years and then decided to take a break from practice to retool and study building performance at Carnegie Mellon. So that was kind of born out of, an interest in not pursuing my current career trajectory, but also pursuing a passion for sustainability, and felt that at that point, I couldn't, sort of get that experience in practice. And the best way to kind of make that transition was to go back to school. So I went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh to study building performance. And
How technical is that program, Phillip? Sorry to interrupt, but I just have to know how much of a technical dive is that program?
it was all engineers. I was the only architect in the program. It was a small program, but very technical. So very engineering focused, building physics. But there was what was, I would say, pretty unique about that program was that there was a strong emphasis on tying sustainability strategies back to occupant well-being and productivity. So really making strong connections between our design strategies, sustainability strategies, and ultimately what that means for the occupants and their experience inside buildings. And that was largely sort of driven by the director of the program, whose name was Vivian Lofness. She did a ton of research in that area for decades. Yeah. So after Carnegie Mellon, the intention was to roll right into something full-time sustainability thereafter. But because of job searching, markets, etc., I went back to practice as a project architect for about 4 years. This takes us up to sort of pandemic era. And so I was a practicing architect, and it was at that job that I got a lot of exposure on adaptive reuse projects in New York City in particular. And so after that, I transitioned into the role that I'm now, which is sustainable design leader at HDR. And I cover the Northeast region, sort of Boston down to DC, and work with teams to set goals on sustainability, building performance, and within our sort of core group of sustainability leaders, I also am sort of situated in the kind of high performance or performative design group, which focuses a lot on analytics and the sort of data we need to prove out a lot of our design decisions.
Yeah, very cool. All right, I want to dive straight to the topic that made me reach out to you in the first place, and that's adaptive reuse. Okay, for anybody who's been living under a rock or hiding away somewhere, maybe they don't know the definition. So, Philip, could you share your definition of adaptive reuse and tell us why the field is so important these days, or in
Yeah,
general?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So at a very basic level, I would say that adaptive reuse really is the repurposing of existing buildings or places, I'll say, to function in a new way that extends its life or reimagines its value to society. And so 80% of the built environment that will exist at sort of critical climate thresholds like 2030 and 2050 is already built today, right? So, yes, we will always have to do new building, but 80% of buildings and the opportunity to solve the climate challenge lies in existing buildings. And so, within that, so at that basic level, yes, it's reimagining buildings for a new function or purpose. And in doing so, we're sort of evaluating the relationship to society, culture. And then there's kind of I'll just introduce a couple sort of transitions that listeners are probably familiar with, which are a, a transition from industrial buildings to cultural buildings, right? I think we all could probably think of one or a handful of buildings at least where it was an industrial building and it was transformed into, in a lot of cases, it's some kind of arts building. There's really world-class examples of those. There's also industrial to ecological, which could be, I'm thinking of waterfronts, right? The transition of where industry went all the way up to a waterfront in urban areas, and that over the last decade or two or more, the industry and culturally we've sort of questioned that and sort of re-examined that. And so we're seeing, and we have seen, large swaths of riverfront, for example, being returned to the public with, in some cases, really thoughtful integration of sort of natural and ecological systems into those parks. And then third, I'll just highlight it, office to residential, because it's a really poignant sort of example of adaptive reuse at this time, given that many cities or most cities are facing a real shortage in housing. And so, and also a sort of surplus in underutilized office space. And so there's, in particular in New York, we have that challenge, and it's a difficult sort of nut to crack because of, and we can sort of go into that in detail, but it is not a hard problem to solve. But so those are just sort of three examples of, highlighting some ways that buildings are transitioning from one use to another. And there are many others. And then also, just to sort of wrap up the kind of high level summary of that, is that we simply can't afford to build only new buildings or demolish existing ones. We can't afford to do either of those things. And so really, if we're serious about addressing the climate, then we have to, be engaged in adaptive reuse and take that challenge head on.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Okay, well, let's move from the general to the specific. Let's pick an example, say one that people might know, and talk about, the principles of how the principles of adaptive reuse were applied to that particular project.
Sure. Yeah. So let me just start by kind of laying out some of those principles in detail. So there's really kind of four that I'll highlight, four principles. The first being integrity, which, the easiest way to kind of wrap your head around that is probably structural integrity, right? When we're looking for opportunities in existing buildings, first and foremost, we usually need to make sure that those buildings are structurally sound. Then there's also kind of social and cultural integrity, which is sort of relating back to that idea that a big part of adaptive reuse is for the designer to examine, what is this building going to mean and how is it going to be relevant to society moving forward and for whatever purpose the client intends to use it for. So that's one, integrity. The next is flexibility. So just as when we're engaging in adaptive reuse, we want to extend its life. And there's certain qualities about space and the characteristics of existing buildings that can make it either more difficult or easier to adapt. And part of that is how flexible is that building. In a lot of cases, I think there's it will be easy to find examples of adaptive reuse where there are sort of large, expansive spaces, right? There's many examples of existing buildings that were industrial and now they were transformed into something else. But there's something about that expansiveness of that space that helps maintain flexibility. Then there's memory, right? So the existing building has a memory to it, right? It has a history. The community that lives nearby that building has a relationship to it. It's part of the urban fabric. It was perhaps a building that they've visited. And so there is a sort of memory there that needs to be thought about. And then finally, sustainability, right? There are also certain characteristics of existing buildings that could make it harder or easier to adapt to be energy efficient, for example. But also then there's a whole question about embodied carbon that we should probably touch on a little bit. But what I'll say initially is that existing buildings that have endured over time, in many cases, they have an inherent durability to it because of the types of materials and how they were constructing the buildings. And even though from an embodied carbon perspective, they were perhaps expending more carbon than we would look to expend were we to build a new building today, that because of that durability, that carbon was sort of amortized over a long period of time. And so that really puts the building in a good position and the project in a good position to have a positive climate impact because you're taking advantage of that long duration and lifespan of that building and looking to extend it even further. So, okay, so just to recap, it's integrity, flexibility, memory, and sustainability. And so there's two or three like really high profile projects that I'll highlight. That one is the Moynihan train hall in New York City, which is an extension of Penn Station. The other is the High Line, also in New York City. So the first Moynihan train hall is an adaptive reuse of what was the largest and sort of main post office in New York City. It's in the core of Manhattan, and it was a huge post office building, sort of neoclassical. And so the transition there is from post office to train station. There was a sort of central courtyard space in that building that was turned into the main sort of concourse for the train hall, and it had really long span beams, and there was a great opportunity to bring tons of natural light into that concourse level, and provide a really sort of unique and also thoughtful, from an occupant well-being perspective, travelers experience for the train station. And I think that in contrast to the Penn Station that a lot of commuters are using, which is the one that's buried below Madison Square Garden, I think the new Moynihan train hall really highlights, I think, for the city what a world-class train station could be. It sort of reintroduces the idea that train stations can have these tremendous volumes of space that provide light and are just great places to meet and walk through, not unlike Grand Central Station. And so there were elements of Moynihan Train Hall when they were designing the roof of the building that they decided to keep existing long span steel trusses in place. And then they would infill in between that with these beautiful kind of new sort of organically shaped skylights. And so that's a sort of really good example of adaptive reuse. And then the next one, the High Line, which I'm sure many listeners are also familiar with, is a transition from an existing elevated rail line that kind of stitched its way through Chelsea in Manhattan. Was for decades and decades after the rail line was ceased to be in service, the elevated rail line just be sort of collected interesting seeds from all kinds of native species and became this sort of wild sort of meadow within the city. And so when folks kind of rediscovered it as an opportunity and said, hey, like, what should we do with this? You could go up to the High Line and experience like somewhat of a natural meadow in the heart of Manhattan. And so the designers really took inspiration from that and turned it into a linear park, elevated park through a few neighborhoods. And then along that linear park, you could experience different sort of ecological atmospheres, sort of a more woodland atmosphere and sort of grasslands and meadows. And what it did for the neighborhood is incredible. So the High Line really is a prime example for how adaptive reuse can completely transform neighborhoods. And so after the kind of stage one of the High Line was built, there were, it attracted all kinds of developers and world-class architects. It sort of became like the go-to neighborhood in the city for architects to build new buildings. And so it completely transformed the neighborhood there. And now it actually was just recently extended over to connect to the train stations at Penn Station. So those are the two kind of initial buildings, but there are many more examples of adaptive reuse that are less high profile than that, and also are much more, I would say, community driven as well.
Yeah, I wanted to pick a couple of high profile ones just to, ones that people knew because it'd be easier to tell the story. I want to pick on one of the four parameters that you'd mentioned, Philip. I want to talk about memory specifically. And
Mhm.
I'm curious about that balancing act between, preservation of the historical integrity, the historical identity of the structure, with the need for modern functionality and the need for sustainability, is there a playbook for that? Is there, is there a checklist for that? Or is it just a new adventure every time with maybe a set of basic fundamental principles?
So I think there are a couple things that are kind of unique considerations or skill sets that are going to help negotiate that transition from, you know, and sensitivity for historical value and moving that building into a modern functionality. And the first would be community engagement, which of course depends on the building type. I think, like we said earlier, when you're dealing with existing buildings, there's a context, a history, and an engagement with the community that's already there. And so I think there's an opportunity, at least, to understand, how the repurposing of that building is going to re-engage the community in a different way. And so I think that's, it's again, it's based on the use of the building, right? So if certain buildings are more public, others less so. If it's an office build, transition to office or commercial space, there may be less opportunity to engage the community there. But I think that is just inherently an opportunity for adaptive reuse that was not, you know, maybe not a sort of prime consideration for new construction. I think there's also forensic skill set or sensitivity where anyone who's done an adaptive reuse building and gone through that process knows that like you can only know so much before you start construction. And so there's a process by which you want to go through and really understand the building as much as you can while you're in design. There will always be unknowns, but I think the important thing is you want to understand it to a point where you can, as part of the design, start to do some selective editing, right? You understand what can and should be removed versus what should stay. And and then depending on if you're doing an addition to the building or something, you want to have a general understanding about zoning and what are the opportunities there. And then I think the third thing I would say for balancing historical integrity and modern functionality is this a question. I'll introduce a term: sufficiency. So we want to, when we're approaching an adaptive reuse project, we want to sort of challenge our perceptions of what a modern building is and looks like and feels like. And I think in a lot of cases, you can tie that back to this idea of sufficiency. So we're trying to, which also relates to flexibility, but the idea is that, you know, we're transitioning the building to something that needs to operate efficiently and for a new purpose. It has to meet all of the modern codes for accessibility, fire life safety, etc. And so we also have to navigate the challenges of, sustainability and embodied carbon. And so we're asking ourselves in the design process, where do we draw the line for, what is enough as part of our new design? And so one example of that is that we will, when we're designing the interiors of a new building, we would likely want to ask the question of, how much new material do we want to introduce to the interiors? Can we forego finished ceilings in some areas? And where does it make sense to expose existing finishes, whether it's a brick finish or perhaps there's existing timber framing somewhere? And so we can, as a design strategy, start to, as we're peeling back the layers of an existing building, ask ourselves, well, where do we want to expose certain things versus cover them up? So I think that those are kind of, yeah, the community engagement, forensics, and sort of idea of sufficiency are kind of three considerations and kind of skill sets, I guess, that are really important for transitioning from something that might have historical value to a modern functionality.
Brilliant. Just brilliant. Okay, let's talk about one. You mentioned codes. You know, how much do modern codes get in the way of adaptive reuse? Or maybe a better thing to say is, are there specific codes that really create challenges for an adaptive reuse project?
I think there probably aren't any that come to mind that are more challenging than others, or I would say more challenging for adaptive reuse than a new building per se. There are so just to highlight one, accessibility, right? Like there's if we were to do a new building, that one actually is in some cases going to be more challenging for adaptive reuse project because it was built likely before there were accessibility codes. And so you have existing conditions that are just non-compliant, and you've got to figure out a way to make it work. And I think within that, right, there's always opportunity for creativity too. And so in some cases where there were existing floor transitions and you have to figure out ways to make those transitions without making it seem like there's something alien to the design. And so you can do something interesting with ramps or sloped floors or something to that effect, just as one example for accessibility. So there, for accessibility, you are dealing with existing conditions that are just not going to be designed for that with that in mind. And then for energy efficiency, I think well, let me go to that net third because that might be a good transition to something else. So fire safety codes. So here again, there are sensitivities to that. I think that what's going to be a driver there in a lot of cases is that you're probably not going to want to spend a lot of money and effort to add a whole lot of fire resistance to what's already there in a lot of cases. I think you're kind of probably going to situate yourself in terms of the building classification, right, and how fire resistant that existing structure is. That's going to kind of dictate in most cases, I think, where you fall on that spectrum of a building that's very fire resistant versus less fire resistant. And I think within that question of fire and life safety is also an interesting idea that I've seen once or twice, which is for an adaptive reuse project, you can now start to introduce new materials, or in some cases, it was a building that was maybe a combination of masonry and timber framing. And now you can reintroduce mass timber and CLT as a sort of intervention into that existing building, which of course has really good embodied carbon. It looks really attractive from an embodied carbon perspective and also it sort of stays within that existing character of the building. So I think fire life safety, that's going to kind of largely be driven by what's already there. And then energy efficiency is the third, which is that existing buildings are a lot of times built with passive strategies in mind. And in particular, the proportions and locations of skylights or window openings. If we think about a grade school building that's built, in the first half of the 20th century, at least, it was probably designed with, in some cases, they were built before electric lighting, right? And so they had to design their windows proportionally to keep the spaces daylit. And so you end up with these buildings that have really generously proportioned windows. And then also many of the buildings are uninsulated. And so I think you have some challenges there, but also, there's also opportunities, right? There's in some cases the buildings were built with a lot of thermal mass, and that certainly helps you as well. So it may be the case that you don't need to add a whole lot of insulation in some areas because of the thermal mass, but the windows are something that are definitely in the building envelope in general are things that are going to be challenging to solve, but also have opportunities within them, right? So I think on the daylight side, we want to, when we're designing for daylight, whether it's a new building or dealing with an existing building, we want to first start with, how do we provide enough daylight to a space so that it's sufficiently daylit, and daylit ideally to the point where we can rely predominantly on natural light versus artificial light.
Short lifespan, single use plastic glazing is not a sustainable solution for daylighting. Solera is the glass based alternative for the new millennium. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
So that would be the first step, and then from there we would sort of move into a kind of a more detailed and granular look at how do we control glare, and how do we ensure that the light is being filtered and controlled in a way that is going to make the occupants comfortable inside.
Yeah, you and I will have to talk offline about that. I can certainly help in that regard. But for now, I want to talk about the learning that comes from adaptive reuse. So, besides learning how to be better at adaptive reuse, are we developing methodologies and technologies that will also influence new construction as we go forward?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. I think that in terms of new technologies, I know, speaking from experience, we have, for existing buildings, put an emphasis on, in going back to that question of assessing what you have in the existing building that you're going to be working in, doing a comprehensive assessment of that building. And in a lot of cases nowadays, we would look towards something like laser scanning to get a full digital model of that existing building. I think the challenge in terms of timing there is, like, we ideally want to only bring the scanning in once we've already kind of peeled back whatever layers we think we're not going to keep, so that you're only capturing the things that you are keeping in relatively high fidelity. And that's goes for interiors and the exterior of the building. And for New York City, at least, and other urban projects where that scanning and that really granular level of detail comes in handy, is that the buildings were built right up to lot lines in many cases. And so we're now looking to improve the performance of those buildings for energy efficiency, decarbonization. We also, in a lot of cases, want to give the building a new presence and sort of image. And that is a big part of the sort of regeneration of that building's life, is to give it a new appearance. There are the buildings that have great historical character and are beautiful architecturally, and by and large, we don't need to do much to those. They can endure from an aesthetics perspective. But there are also the type of sort of utilitarian or industrial buildings that didn't really have a whole lot of character or aesthetic value. And in some cases, it is worthwhile to reclad an entire existing building. And when you have an existing building built right up to the lot line, you have inches and fractions of inches to get the new envelope outboard of the existing building. And so scanning can be a really useful technology to take advantage of. I think, just in terms of process and thinking of the advantages for the industry for engaging more in adaptive reuse, it's, I think, at a fundamental level, it's sort of the recognition that a building is just a moment in time. It is not, historically, we as an industry have talked about buildings where it's designed, a new building is designed, it's constructed, and then it sort of gets handed off, and it's sort of anyone's guess as to how it operates and evolves from that point forward. But I think working on adaptive reuse projects really highlights that the building that you're using as your starting point for departure already has a history to it. It has a cultural and societal history to it. It also has all the materials in a project have a history to them to themselves. And so those are things that we should be considering more. So I think that recognition that we're sort of at a moment on a timeline and looking to extend that timeline is a really valuable kind of shift for designing buildings. I think another thing I would highlight, which is also this does touch a little bit on technology, but it's sort of like building science in a way, where when we look at old buildings, a lot of times the buildings that are the durable ones that are lasting as long as they have the ability to continue lasting into the future are built with those durable materials, which also tend to be less complex. There are less layers to them. They are sort of monolithic in nature. And and so I think when we're renovating those existing buildings and repurposing them, we should be asking ourselves what kinds of materials and systems and complexity should we be reintroducing or not into this building so that when it gets to its second end of life, let's say in 60, 70 years from now, can someone take those materials that we're reintroducing into a building and repurpose them again in some way? The way we build buildings now with tons of layers, right? Like we have a wall assembly or roof assembly and all these assemblies, they're using all kinds of composite materials. Each layer, there's like a dozen or half a dozen layers to an assembly. Each one is doing a very specific function. I think when we're tying this all into embodied carbon and the idea of a circular economy, I think we do need to start to question, that complexity of material assemblies. So I think there's an opportunity, right? Like in the example I mentioned where we're introducing something like mass timber into an adaptive reuse project, that would be a great example of taking a monolithic material and using it as a building component that could then be, if it's not of value in that context that it's deployed, could be repurposed for something else later on. So I think circularity and buildings as material banks are things, ideas, sort of frameworks that are really valuable for us to think about and are really highlighted by working on adaptive reuse projects because we have that existing context already and have to negotiate what we're keeping and what we're removing and how these materials are going to have a second, third, or fourth life moving forward.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think they used the term talking about the layers and the composites. I think the term monstrous hybrid was the term that
Mm,
was used in cradle to cradle. So it's
uh-huh.
interesting to really see the implications of it, and nothing would show those implications more plainly than an adaptive reuse project for sure. Okay, we're running out of time. I want to ask the $1 million question that I always ask Philip. Every guest I ask this question, and I ask them to answer from their own perspective.
Mm.
And that is what makes a great building.
All right. For me, making a great building is one that makes the occupants feel good. And and that could mean a lot of things. I'm trying to think of the buildings that I feel drawn to, and I think it's a rich sort of sensory experience. Could be tactility, could be the quality of light, sort of the ability to move to different parts of a space and experience even varied temperatures. I mean, for me personally, that's something that is interesting to me. And so I think all of those things, so a building that makes you feel good. And I think that's so important because it's really the buildings that we feel we have a strong connection to that are the ones that are going to endure for generations because they engender a sense of belonging and stewardship. And as we've kind of talked about today, is that a building, once it gets built and occupied, is not a sort of static thing by any means. It's something that evolves over time, and there's a lot of people that are responsible for the maintenance and operation of buildings, and to the extent that the people working or living in those buildings, but also the visitors of buildings feel strongly connected to them and are left with a positive feeling, then I think those, you know, that's the kind of key to us as designers being able to ensure that the longevity of our buildings, and that hopefully that someone down the road sees them as an opportunity for adaptive reuse in the
Brilliant.
future.
Brilliant. No, absolutely brilliant. All right, Philip, before we go, is there anything you'd like to announce? Any exciting news that you'd like to share?
I don't have any
No
exciting news.
pressure.
I will say though, it's just coming off the heels of green builds last week. I think there's a lot of, again, sort of a sense of the industry kind of taking the reins and really having to lead in a new way moving forward. And so I think that's really kind of empowering. And I think the work that we're all doing is incredibly valuable and hopefully going to help accelerate sustainability and where we need to be.
Wonderful. Philip, thank you so much. That was so insightful. It was almost like a little going to school, listening to you speak and help us understand, the real challenges and the real opportunities of adaptive reuse. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Joe. It was a pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.